James Carter had lived in this city for over 60 years. He had seen its streets change, watched new buildings rise and old neighborhoods disappear, witnessed progress and regression in equal measure. The small corner store he had walked into that evening was one he had visited hundreds of times before. The same flickering neon sign, the same narrow aisles packed with snacks and drinks, the same bored teenager behind the counter who barely looked up when he entered. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a routine stop to grab a bottle of water before heading home. But James had long learned that for a black man, even the most ordinary moments could turn into something dangerous. He had felt the weight of eyes on him the second he stepped inside. It was a familiar feeling, one that had followed him since childhood, the unspoken suspicion, the silent judgment that people carried in their glances, in their tightened grips on purses, in the way their conversations would suddenly stop when he walked by. He had learned to ignore it, to push forward and not let it dictate his life. But tonight, the weight was heavier, more menacing. Ryan Collins stood near the front of the store, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his police badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was off duty, still in his uniform but without the burden of responsibility that came with it. And yet, in his mind, that uniform meant he could do whatever he pleased. To Collins, being a cop wasn't just a job, it was power, the kind that allowed him to decide who belonged and who didn't, who deserved to walk free and who needed to be put in their place. James didn't notice him at first. He walked slowly, his body aching from the years of hard work and long days. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of labor, reached for a cold bottle of water from the fridge. He pulled it out, glanced toward the counter, and started making his way forward. That was when he saw the officer watching him, those sharp, pale blue eyes filled with something that made James's stomach tighten. He had seen that look before. James had spent his life trying to be a good man. He worked hard, paid his taxes, raised his son with the values of respect and dignity. He had taught Malik that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes people would judge him before he even opened his mouth. But he had also taught him to stand tall, to never let anyone strip him of his worth. And yet, standing there in that store, James felt like a boy again, like the 13-year-old who had been chased out of a diner by a white man with a bat, like the young worker who had been denied a promotion for reasons no one would say out loud, like the man who had been stopped by police more times than he could count, asked the same questions, treated with the same suspicion. Collins took a step forward, blocking his path. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You lost, old man." James frowned, gripping the bottle a little tighter. "Just buying some water." Collins let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if James had said something funny. "Yeah. And you got money for that?" James felt his chest tighten. He had heard this before. He had lived this before. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady. "I don't want trouble. But trouble seems to follow you people, doesn't it?" The words hit harder than any punch ever could. James's grip on the bottle loosened slightly, his knuckles no longer white. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the sting of old wounds being reopened. He wanted to walk away, to avoid what he knew was coming, but Collins wasn't going to let him. Before James could move, Collins reached out and grabbed the bottle from his hand, tossing it carelessly onto a nearby shelf. "How about you step outside?" James's heart pounded. He wasn't young anymore. He wasn't strong like he used to be. But he had spent his life fighting to be treated like a man, and he wasn't going to let this officer strip him of his dignity. He squared his shoulders, looking Collins directly in the eye. "There a problem here?" Collins's smirk faded. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his side. "Yeah. You're the problem." James didn't get a chance to respond before Collins shoved him hard. His body stumbled backward, knocking over a rack of snacks. The sound of bags hitting the floor seemed to echo through the store, but no one moved. No one said a word. The cashier had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. A woman near the door had frozen, her phone in her hand, but she wasn't calling anyone. She was just staring, wide-eyed, waiting to see what would happen next. James coughed, trying to steady himself, but before he could fully regain his footing, Collins was on him again. A hand clamped onto his wrist, twisting his arm behind his back in a way that sent a sharp jolt of pain through his shoulder. His knees buckled slightly, but he didn't fall. Not yet. You think you can just walk in here like you own the place? Collins hissed, his voice dangerously low. James gritted his teeth. I'm just trying to leave. You're not going anywhere. And then, before James could even process what was happening, he felt the officer's hand wrap around his throat. The air in the store shifted. The tension became something alive, something suffocating. The grip was firm at first, just enough to remind James of the power Collins held over him. But then it tightened. Harder. His lungs screamed for air. His hands clawed at Collins's wrist, but the younger, stronger man barely flinched. James's vision blurred, his mind struggling to comprehend how this was happening, how he had ended up here, in this moment, gasping for breath on the floor of a store he had shopped at for years. And then, suddenly, the doors burst open. The voice that followed was sharp, commanding, filled with something colder than rage. Get your hands off him. Now. Collins froze. His grip loosened just enough for James to suck in a ragged breath, coughing violently as his body convulsed from the lack of oxygen. He barely had the strength to turn his head, but when he did, his heart nearly stopped. Because standing there, framed by the bright store lights, was a man Collins never expected to see. Malik Carter. The chief of police. And James's son. The old man barely had time to react before the officer's hand was on his chest, shoving him backward with brute force. His frail body hit the shelves behind him, rattling bottles and knocking over a display of snacks. His breathing turned shallow, panic rising in his chest as he raised his hands in surrender, his voice trembling with disbelief. I just wanted to buy some water. But the officer's eyes were filled with something darker, something that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the color of his skin. The old man could see it clearly now. This wasn't about a supposed crime, a misunderstanding, or even an overreaction. This was pure hatred. You people always think you can just walk in anywhere, take whatever you want, and get away with it, the officer spat, his voice dripping with contempt as he stepped closer, towering over him like a predator cornering its prey. The humiliation burned like fire under his skin. He had lived through so much, seen so much. But no matter how many decades passed, no matter how much the world claimed to have changed, moments like this reminded him that, to some, he was still just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance of the convenience store. The cashier, a young white man, looked frozen in place, gripping the counter with wide eyes. A woman clutched her purse, inching toward the exit, avoiding eye contact like she hadn't just witnessed an old man being assaulted for nothing. The officer grabbed his arm, wrenching it behind his back with unnecessary force. Let's see some ID. It's in my pocket, he stammered, his body tense with pain. The officer yanked him forward, his breath hot against his ear. Then get it. Slowly. His trembling hand reached for his wallet, but before he could even grasp it, the officer's knee slammed into his stomach. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as the air was knocked out of his lungs. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the dirty floor, gasping for breath. The room spun. His heart pounded against his ribs like a caged animal. He could hear the murmurs of onlookers, but no one stepped in. No one stopped this from happening. Don't move, the officer warned, his boot pressing down against his back, pinning him like he was nothing more than a piece of trash on the sidewalk. A wave of helplessness washed over him, the bitter taste of metal filling his mouth as his cheek pressed against the cold tile. How many times had he seen this happen? How many times had he begged for the world to change? And yet, here he was. An old man, weak and unarmed, being crushed beneath the weight of racism and power, just another nameless victim in a country that pretended it was better than this. Please. His voice came out weak, barely a whisper. But the officer only chuckled, a low, cruel sound that sent chills down his spine. You think begging is gonna help you? You think you matter? And then, the worst of it. The officer's hands wrapped around his throat. A silent, suffocating terror consumed him. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, and his fingers scratched weakly against the floor. This was it. This was how he was going to die. For nothing. For existing. Then, suddenly, the front doors of the store slammed open. A sharp, commanding voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Get your hands off of him. Now. Everything froze. The officer's grip loosened, just slightly. The old man gasped for air, coughing violently as his body convulsed from the lack of oxygen. Through tear-blurred eyes, he turned his head toward the entrance. And there, standing in the doorway, was someone he never expected to see. Someone who wasn't just another bystander. Someone who held more power than anyone in that room. The air changed. The officer stiffened, his face draining of color as he recognized the figure standing before him. Because in that moment, he realized the truth. He had just tried to murder the father of the most powerful police official in the city. And justice was about to be served. But how far would it go? And what price would he pay for his hate? At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination in all forms. This story is a powerful reminder of the struggles that many black people face every day, but also of the strength, resilience, and justice that must prevail. No one should ever be judged or mistreated because of their skin color. If you've ever experienced injustice, know that you are seen, you are heard, and you matter. This platform supports you, and we will always use our stories to highlight truth, fight prejudice, and inspire change. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional story. Justice will be served. Subscribe to Plow of Twist and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our gripping stories. Enjoy the story. Malik Carter had never moved so fast in his life. The second he stepped through that door, his pulse was already pounding, his hands curling into fists at his sides, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. The scene in front of him sent a firestorm through his veins. His father, crumpled on the floor, gasping for air, while a man in a police uniform stood over him, still gripping his throat as if he had the right. As if James Carter were nothing. As if his life had no weight. Collins turned, his face shifting from cruelty to confusion in the blink of an eye, his hands instinctively pulling back. But it was too late. Malik had seen everything. Every goddamn second of it. What the hell do you think you're doing? Malik's voice was lethal, low and sharp, the kind that cut through the air like a blade. His eyes were locked on Collins, cold and unreadable, the way they got when he was dealing with something bigger than anger, something deeper, more dangerous. Collins straightened, his stance shifting, suddenly aware of the weight in the room. His gaze flicked to Malik's uniform, to the badge pinned to his chest, to the authority that radiated off him like a storm. Sir, Chief Carter, shut your damn mouth. Malik took a step forward, his entire body thrumming with controlled rage. I asked you a question. What the hell do you think you're doing? Collins hesitated. He looked down at James, who was still on his hands and knees, his breath ragged, his fingers trembling as he tried to brace himself against the floor. Then he looked back at Malik, something shifting in his eyes, a flicker of realization, the slow dawn of understanding what he had done. He was resisting, Collins stammered, straightening his shoulders as if he could salvage the situation. I thought, he refused to show ID, and Malik's laugh was sharp, humorless, venomous. Oh, so now he was resisting? That's the story you're going with? His head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. You really expect me to believe that? Collins opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew there was no talking his way out of this, but he was too arrogant, too deep into his own belief that he was untouchable to stop himself from trying. I didn't know. You didn't know what? Malik's voice cut through the excuse like a knife. That you were attacking an innocent man? That you were choking an old man on the floor of a convenience store? Or is it that you didn't know he was my father? Silence. Collins didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth was, if James hadn't been Malik's father, none of this would be happening. If James had been any other black man, the incident would have been buried, the body cam footage mysteriously missing, the witnesses suddenly unable to recall what they had seen. Collins would have walked out of that store like it was just another night, and James would have been just another headline, or worse, just another name that never made it to the news at all. But now, things were different. Malik stepped closer, his presence a force of nature. Collins flinched slightly, a barely there movement, but Malik caught it. Good. Let him feel what it's like to be powerless. Let him feel what it's like to have someone with authority staring him down, ready to rip his life apart. Step away from him, Malik ordered, his voice so sharp it could cut glass. Collins hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. For a second, just a second, there was something in his face, defiance. As if he was actually considering standing his ground. As if he thought that his badge, his uniform, his whiteness, still gave him power here. But the moment passed, and he stepped back, his jaw tightening. James coughed again, his body shaking slightly, and Malik immediately crouched beside him, one hand gripping his father's shoulder, his voice dropping low. Dad. Are you okay? James nodded weakly, but the pain in his eyes said more than words ever could. This wasn't just about what had happened tonight. This was about every single moment like this in James Carter's life. Every humiliation, every injustice, every time he had swallowed his rage just to stay alive. Malik could see it all, feel it all, and it burned. He helped James sit up, his father's breathing still uneven, but stronger now. He turned his head slightly, scanning the store, the witnesses. No one had done a damn thing. Not the cashier. Not the woman who had recorded but never stepped in. Not the man by the fridge who had kept his head down, pretending not to see. And yet now that Malik had arrived, they were watching. Waiting. As if they wanted to see what happened next. He didn't give them the satisfaction. Malik stood, his gaze locking back onto Collins. His voice was deadly calm. Turn around. Collins blinked. What? Turn around. Collins's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his shoulders tightening. He hesitated for a moment, but the authority in Malik's voice was unshakable. Slowly, reluctantly, Collins turned. Malik reached for his belt, pulled out his cuffs. He saw Collins's back stiffen. The tension in the room thickened. What the hell are you doing? Collins said, his voice lower now, laced with something that sounded an awful lot like fear. You assaulted a civilian. Malik's voice was matter of fact, like he was stating something as simple as the weather. Used excessive force. Attempted strangulation. A pause. Attempted murder. Collins's breath hitched. He knew what this meant. He knew how fast this could spiral. You can't, yes. I can. Malik snapped the cuffs onto Collins's wrists. The sound was loud in the store, echoing, final, irreversible. And just like that, the power shifted. Collins wasn't a cop anymore. He wasn't in control. He was just another man in cuffs. The silence that followed was thick, electric, unbearable. Malik could feel the weight of every single set of eyes on them, the shift in the room, the unspoken truth that no one had ever expected this to happen. And yet, here they were. Malik exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Because this was just the beginning. Collins had no idea what was coming next. Collins's breathing had changed. It was shallow now, controlled, but Malik could see the tremor in his hands, the tension in his jaw. The reality was sinking in. This wasn't just a bad day on the job. This wasn't something he could sweep under the rug, make disappear with a well-placed excuse or a falsified report. No, this was different. He was in handcuffs, under arrest, and the man standing in front of him wasn't just any officer. It was Malik Carter, the chief of police. And the man he had brutalized on the floor of that store was his father. The shift in power was undeniable, and yet, Collins still carried himself like someone who thought there might be a way out. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the store, the faces of the witnesses who still stood frozen in shock. Some had their phones out now, recording the moment. He knew what that meant. There would be no quiet cover-up, no backdoor negotiations. This was public. And he was the criminal now. Malik tightened his grip on Collins's arm as he began leading him out of the store, past the shelves, past the rows of candy and drinks, past the people who had done nothing but watch. As they stepped outside, the night air hit hard, crisp and cold, amplifying the murmurs of the growing crowd. The flashing blue and red lights of arriving patrol cars painted streaks across the pavement. Officers were stepping out, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief as they recognized who was in cuffs. "Chief, what's going on?" One of them, Officer Ramirez, hesitated as he stepped forward, eyes flickering between Malik and Collins. "What does it look like?" Malik's voice was steady, but beneath it was a storm. He had to keep his control. He couldn't afford to lose it. "Not here. Not yet." Collins, for the first time, truly felt it. His breathing picked up, his muscles tensed. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was real. He glanced around, as if searching for an ally, someone who would vouch for him, who would step in and stop this before it went any further. But no one did. Then, finally, he spoke, voice sharp but laced with something Malik immediately recognized: fear. "You're making a mistake." Malik's grip didn't loosen. He kept walking, dragging Collins toward the patrol car waiting at the curb. "You mean the way you made a mistake when you put your hands on my father?" Collins scoffed, shaking his head, the last remnants of his arrogance still flickering beneath the panic. "You don't want to do this, Carter." Malik didn't respond. He shoved him forward, opening the car door, forcing him to sit. "I was doing my job," Collins spat, trying to find footing in his crumbling defense. He didn't show ID. He was being uncooperative. Malik leaned down, his voice low and steady. "Say that again." Collins hesitated. "I want you to say that again," Malik repeated, staring him down, the weight of the moment pressing between them. "Tell me how an old man, buying a bottle of water, was a threat." Collins's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Tell me how putting your hands around his throat was doing your job." Silence. And then, Malik saw it. The moment when Collins understood. There was no getting out of this. The door slammed shut. Malik turned, inhaling deeply, trying to steady himself. His heart was a relentless drum inside his chest, but on the surface, he looked unshaken. That was how he had been trained, to keep his emotions locked down, to never let them see when he was close to breaking. James was standing now, supported by another officer, his breathing steadier but his body still weak. Malik moved toward him, his steps slower, more careful now. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder, squeezing gently. "I'm okay," James said, voice hoarse. Malik nodded, his jaw tightening. He wanted to believe that. But he knew better. James wasn't okay. And neither was he. A commotion stirred behind them. A couple of reporters had arrived, drawn by the lights, the noise, the whispers of what had just taken place. The city had been tense for a long time. Stories like this, black man brutalized by police, were nothing new. But this? A white officer being arrested, in public, by a black police chief, for attacking his own father. This was different. One of the reporters, a woman with a microphone in hand, stepped forward, her gaze locked onto Malik. "Chief Carter, can you comment on what just happened?" Malik exhaled, his eyes flickering to James, to the store, to the patrol car where Collins sat staring at nothing, his face pale, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He knew what this moment meant. The world was watching. So he spoke, voice clear, unwavering. "What happened tonight should have never happened," he said, each word deliberate, filled with controlled rage. "My father could have died. And if he had been anyone else, maybe no one would have cared. Maybe the story wouldn't have even made it past this block. But I care. And I will make sure this never happens again." The cameras clicked. The murmurs grew. But Malik wasn't finished. This is what happens when men like Ryan Collins believe they are above the law. When they think that wearing a badge means they get to decide who lives and who dies. Collins shifted slightly in the back seat, his jaw clenching, but he didn't say a word. He couldn't. This is not just about tonight. It's about every man, every woman, every child who has suffered at the hands of people like him. Malik's eyes scanned the crowd, meeting gazes that were filled with something he knew well, anger, grief, exhaustion. "And I promise you, this is just the beginning." He turned to James again, lowering his voice so only his father could hear. "You ready to go home?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Let's go home." But Malik knew, this fight was far from over. The ride back home was silent, but it was a silence filled with weight, with things unsaid, with emotions that neither man knew how to put into words just yet. The city lights flickered past the windows, casting streaks of gold and red across the car's interior. Malik kept both hands on the wheel, his grip firm, his knuckles white. His mind was still running through everything that had happened, the way his father had been on the floor, struggling to breathe, the way Collins had looked at him with that smugness, that power, right until the moment he realized it was slipping from his grasp. James sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his lap, fingers still trembling slightly. He hadn't spoken much since they left the scene, except for a quiet "I'm fine" when Malik had asked if he needed anything. But Malik knew his father. He knew when he was holding something in, knew when he was trying to bury his pain deep inside, the way black men had been forced to do for generations. Malik finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "You should have told me you weren't okay." James didn't look at him right away. He exhaled through his nose, his fingers twitching slightly before he finally spoke. "And what would you have done? Shown up sooner? Stopped it before it started?" He shook his head, his gaze distant. "Malik, this wasn't new. This wasn't the first time. And it won't be the last." Malik's grip on the wheel tightened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." James turned then, his eyes searching his son's face, seeing the fire in his expression, the unshakable determination in the way his jaw clenched, the way his body was coiled tight like he was ready for war. He recognized it because he had been that man once. A long time ago. Before he had learned that no matter how much you fought, no matter how much you demanded justice, sometimes the world just didn't care. "You think arresting that man tonight changes anything?" James's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that Malik felt deep in his chest. "It's a start." Malik's voice was firm, unwavering. James exhaled, shaking his head. "I used to think that way too." He let out a dry chuckle, one that held no humor. "You know how many times I was pulled over just for driving through the wrong part of town? How many times I was followed around in stores, treated like a damn thief just for existing?" He gestured toward himself, toward his old, tired body. "And I played by their rules, Malik. I did everything right. I worked hard, I kept my head down, I stayed out of trouble. And tonight, his voice wavered for a second, just a second, before he steadied it again. Tonight, none of that mattered. None of it ever mattered. Malik felt something in his chest tighten, a sharp, burning ache that made it hard to breathe. He swallowed, forcing himself to keep his focus, to keep his emotions in check. It matters now. James looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he sighed. We'll see. The rest of the drive was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with a shared pain that neither man needed to speak aloud. When they pulled up to the house, Malik cut the engine, but neither of them moved right away. The street was quiet, only the soft hum of crickets in the distance. James shifted, finally glancing at his son again. You really think they're gonna let this happen? Malik's eyes met his father's. They don't have a choice. James studied him, his gaze lingering for a long moment before he finally nodded, his expression unreadable. Get some rest, Malik. Malik exhaled, running a hand down his face. Yeah. But they both knew neither of them would be sleeping tonight. The next morning, the world had changed. Malik woke to his phone vibrating relentlessly on his nightstand, the harsh buzz breaking through the thin veil of sleep he had managed to get. He groaned, reaching for it, eyes squinting at the bright screen. Missed calls. Texts. Headlines flashing across news sites. It was everywhere. White officer arrested for assaulting black civilian, by his own police chief's son. Justice or political move. The arrest of Officer Ryan Collins sparks debate. Officer Ryan Collins passed under investigation. Is this just the tip of the iceberg? Malik sat up, his heart pounding. He barely had time to process it before his phone rang again. He answered without checking the number. Carter. The voice on the other end was sharp, cold, familiar. You need to fix this. Malik's grip on the phone tightened. Fix what? You know damn well what. Collins was one of ours. You paraded him in front of cameras like a goddamn criminal. The voice scoffed, full of contempt. You made the whole damn department look weak. Malik's jaw clenched. He recognized that voice. Captain James Holloway. One of the old guards. One of the men who had spent decades protecting the Collinses of the world. I didn't make anyone look weak, Malik said, his voice steady. Collins did that himself. You think this is gonna end well for you? Holloway's voice darkened. You think they're gonna let you stay in that seat after this? You made it personal. Malik leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers pressing into his temples. He let out a slow breath, measured and even. It was personal the moment he put his hands on my father. A pause. Then a low chuckle. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. Malik's eyes burned with exhaustion, with anger, with resolve. No. I'm changing the damn rules. The line went dead. Malik let out a slow breath, setting his phone down, staring at nothing. This wasn't over. He knew that. He had known the second he put the cuffs on Collins that this wouldn't be a clean fight, that they would try to push back, try to protect their own. But they had already lost. Because for the first time, someone like Collins wasn't going to walk away. And Malik would make damn sure of it. The pressure had shifted. The moment Malik had put the cuffs on Collins, he knew the tides had turned, but now the ripples of that decision were turning into waves that threatened to pull him under. The department was divided. The city was divided. Some saw it as justice long overdue, a sign that the system was finally being forced to hold its own accountable. Others, especially those who had spent years benefiting from that same system, saw it as a betrayal. A declaration of war. Malik had never cared about being liked. He hadn't climbed the ranks to make friends. But there was a difference between being respected and being targeted. And after last night, he knew exactly which one he was now. His office had never felt smaller. The blinds were shut, his phone was on silent, and still, he could feel it. The tension in the department, the whispers behind closed doors, the eyes that refused to meet his as he walked past. Even some of the officers he had once trusted had grown quiet, their loyalty uncertain. Because loyalty, he was learning, only lasted as long as it was convenient. A sharp knock on the door broke the silence. He didn't look up right away. He already knew who it was. The door opened before he could answer, and Captain James Holloway stepped in, his movements slow, deliberate. The man carried himself like he owned any room he walked into, and for a long time, that had been true. A white officer with over 30 years on the force, Holloway had seen Malik rise through the ranks, had tolerated it, even supported it when it benefited him. But now, the lines had been drawn. Holloway didn't sit. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make his point clear. You really think this is gonna stick? His voice was smooth, but beneath it was something cold, something sharp-edged. Malik finally looked up, meeting the older man's gaze. It's already stuck. Holloway let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? You think one arrest changes anything? Collins will walk. He's got people backing him. People who matter. Malik leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. People like you. Holloway smirked. People above me. Above you. People who don't like headlines like the ones you just handed the press. He gestured vaguely. You embarrassed this department. And for what? Some old man who should have known better than to run his mouth. Malik's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. But he didn't take the bait. He just watched. Waited. Holloway stepped closer, placing both hands on Malik's desk. His voice dropped lower, quieter. Drop the charges. Malik didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Not happening. A muscle in Holloway's jaw ticked. He straightened, exhaling through his nose, as if forcing himself to stay calm. You don't understand what you've started. The people backing Collins, they don't just want him free. They want you gone. Malik finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his voice even. Good luck with that. Holloway stared at him for a long moment, then let out a humorless laugh. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Malik held his gaze. If I knew when to quit, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair. Holloway didn't argue. He just studied him, as if trying to see past the mask Malik wore, trying to find a crack, a weakness. But Malik had spent his entire life being watched like that. He knew how to hold the stare until the other man looked away first. Finally, Holloway sighed, shaking his head as he turned toward the door. But before he left, he glanced over his shoulder. When this all comes down on you, don't say I didn't warn you. The door closed behind him, and Malik exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers into his temples. He had known this wasn't going to be easy. He had expected the pushback, the quiet threats, the pressure from men like Holloway. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any less exhausting. His phone vibrated. He ignored it. Another message. Another call. The world outside his office was moving at a relentless pace, waiting for his next move. Waiting for him to either stand firm or collapse under the weight of it all. There was no turning back now. The trial came faster than anyone expected. Collins had been denied bail. That alone sent shockwaves through the department. A white officer, sitting in a holding cell, waiting for a trial that he actually had to face. It was unheard of. And the department was losing its mind over it. Malik had spent the days leading up to it bracing for impact. The backlash had been relentless. Protesters outside the courthouse. Angry phone calls from city officials. Even officers within his own department who had made it clear, without saying a word, that they were waiting for him to fail. And Collins? Collins sat in court with that same damn look on his face, the one he'd worn the night of the arrest. The disbelief. The arrogance. The denial. But as the evidence rolled out, the security footage, the witness testimonies, the forensic reports confirming the bruising on James Carter's neck, something in Collins shifted. The certainty in his eyes wavered, cracked. And when the guilty verdict was read, the weight of it finally hit. A ripple of noise spread through the courtroom, gasps, murmurs, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Collins sat there, stiff, unmoving, his hands clenching into fists against the table. His world was collapsing. Malik didn't react. Didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. He just watched. Collins turned, locking eyes with him. And for the first time, he looked afraid. The judge's voice cut through the noise. The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately. Collins stood, his face tight, his shoulders squared like he was still trying to hold on to some piece of the power he once had. But there was nothing left. The officer at his side reached for his hands, pulling them behind his back, snapping on the cuffs. And this time, there was no one to stop it. No one to protect him. No one to save him. Malik exhaled, his gaze steady as Collins was led away. Justice, he knew, was rare. It wasn't always clean. It wasn't always swift. And it sure as hell wasn't perfect. But today, for once, it had landed on the right side. And that was enough. For now. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of flashing cameras, murmured conversations, and the heavy weight of expectation pressing down on Malik's shoulders. The moment Collins was led away, the air outside seemed to shift, a restless storm brewing in the eyes of every reporter, every officer, every bystander waiting to see what would happen next. The guilty verdict had landed like a lightning strike, shocking the system, sending cracks through a foundation that had never been meant to hold men like Collins accountable. And now, they were all waiting, for Malik to react, for him to declare victory, for him to give them the perfect headline. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. This wasn't about victory. It wasn't about celebration. It was about a man who had nearly died on a convenience store floor for daring to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about the weight of every other name that hadn't been given justice. It was about knowing this fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. James stood beside him, his posture straight but tired, his presence enough to silence some of the whispers that floated through the crowd. He hadn't wanted to come. Malik had seen the hesitation in his father's eyes when he suggested it, the way James had shifted uncomfortably, as if his body still carried the memory of Collins's hands on his throat. But in the end, he came. Because he knew, as well as Malik did, that his presence meant something. That seeing him standing there, alive, breathing, unbroken, meant something. A microphone was shoved toward Malik, a question thrown at him like a dart. Chief Carter, do you believe this case will change how the department handles police brutality? Malik exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. He didn't give them what they wanted, no fiery speech, no moment of grandstanding. Instead, his voice was measured, careful. It's a step. But one step doesn't mean the road is clear. Another reporter jumped in. Do you think Officer Collins's sentencing was fair? Malik's jaw clenched for half a second before he forced himself to relax. Fair would have been my father never being put in that position in the first place. James shifted beside him, his hands tightening around the railing. Malik felt it, that quiet anger his father rarely let show, the years of restraint fraying at the edges. James cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask to be another example, another reminder that this keeps happening. But since I am, I'll say this, one man in handcuffs doesn't mean the system is fixed. It means, for once, the system didn't look away. Silence followed. Malik could feel the weight of his father's words settle over the crowd. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, others nodded, but none of them had anything to say in return. Because they knew he was right. Another reporter, bolder than the rest, cut in. "Do you think you'll face retaliation for this, Chief Carter?" Malik's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't need to think about it. He knew. He had already seen it in the department, the unease, the quiet stares, the officers who had suddenly stopped shaking his hand in the hallways. There were men like Holloway, men who had spent years protecting their own, who were waiting for Malik to fall. "I don't make decisions based on fear," Malik said simply. "And I sure as hell don't make them based on who might be uncomfortable with accountability." The murmurs rose again, questions overlapping, voices pressing in on all sides, but Malik was already done. He turned to his father. "Let's go." James hesitated, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, before giving a small nod. They moved through the sea of people, past the cameras, past the officers who still weren't sure whether to stand with or against Malik. But as they walked toward the car, James's voice broke the silence between them. "You really think they're gonna let you keep your job?" Malik's hands flexed around the keys in his grip. "They'll have to take it from me." James let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "They might try." Malik glanced at him. "They can try all they want." James's expression softened, but there was something else there, something Malik couldn't quite place. "You're your mother's son, you know that." Malik's throat tightened. He didn't respond, just started the car, letting the hum of the engine fill the silence. His mother had been the first person to teach him about fighting for what was right, but she had also been the first person to warn him about what it would cost. And Malik knew, deep down, that the cost was just beginning. 2 days later, the fallout started. A formal internal investigation had been launched, not on Collins, but on Malik. The official claim was misconduct, accusations of bias, overreach, making a politically motivated arrest. It was a textbook move. They couldn't save Collins, so they would come for the man who put him away. Malik sat in his office, staring at the document in front of him, fingers drumming slowly against the desk. The hypocrisy of it burned through him, but he wasn't surprised. He had been waiting for this. Preparing for it. A knock at the door. "James." Malik exhaled, gesturing for him to come in. His father stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the file on Malik's desk, eyes narrowing slightly. "They're coming for you," James said, matter-of-factly. Malik leaned back in his chair. "They've been coming for me since the moment I put the cuffs on Collins." James studied him for a long moment, then slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. "So what's the plan?" Malik let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "They expect me to fight it. They expect me to lose my temper, give them an excuse to strip me of my badge." His gaze hardened. "So I won't." James nodded slowly. "You're playing the long game." Malik smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the only way to win." His father was quiet for a moment. Then, finally, he said, "I'm proud of you, Malik." Something in Malik's chest tightened. He looked away, exhaling through his nose. "I'm just doing what has to be done." James studied him, then reached over, gripping Malik's shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. "That's why I'm proud of you." The weight of the moment sat between them, unspoken but understood. Malik nodded once, slowly, and for the first time in days, his shoulders loosened, just slightly. They weren't done. But they weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The storm was far from over. Malik knew that from the moment he walked into the department the next morning and felt the shift in the air. The stares were different now, sharper, heavier. The silence that once carried uncertainty now carried resentment. It was in the way officers moved around him, the way conversations cut short when he entered a room. They weren't just watching him anymore. They were waiting. The internal investigation had spread like wildfire, feeding whispers, stoking fires that had been simmering long before Collins's arrest. Some officers, the ones who had always known the system protected them, were making it clear, in the way they spoke, in the way they didn't speak, that they saw Malik as a problem. And the others? The ones who had wanted to believe that change was possible, that accountability wasn't just a myth. They were watching, too. Watching to see if Malik could survive what came next. His office door was already open when he got there. Inside, waiting for him, was Holloway. The older man sat in the chair across from Malik's desk, calm as ever, fingers laced together, expression unreadable. He had always been good at that, keeping his face neutral, his words measured, his threats buried just deep enough under layers of professionalism. Malik didn't sit. He just stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other hanging at his side, tension thrumming through his body. "You're in my office." Holloway smiled, slow and deliberate. "I figured you'd be coming in early. Thought we should talk." Malik exhaled through his nose, stepping inside, closing the door behind him. He walked around the desk, but didn't sit. He needed to be on his feet for this. "If this is about the investigation, my lawyer will be handling it." Holloway let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You really think a lawyer is gonna save you from this?" Malik's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay still, to stay calm. He had expected this. Expected the pressure, the pushback. But hearing it, sitting across from a man who had spent decades protecting men like Collins, it still made his blood simmer. "I don't need saving," Malik said flatly. "I did my job. I followed the law." Holloway's smile didn't fade, but something in his eyes darkened. "You broke the rules, Carter. Not the ones in the books, but the ones that keep this department standing." Malik leaned forward slightly, his hands pressing against the desk. "If by standing you mean built on a foundation of men like Collins being protected at all costs, then maybe it's time that foundation crumbles." Holloway studied him, his smile finally slipping. He sat back, exhaling through his nose, tapping a finger against the armrest. "You're young. You think you can take the whole system down with you, but the thing about systems, Carter, is that they outlast men like you. Always have, always will." Malik didn't blink. Didn't look away. "You're right. They outlast men like me. But they also outlast men like you." For the first time, Holloway's expression flickered, just for a second. A crack in the composure, in the carefully controlled arrogance. Malik continued, his voice steady. "You've had decades of protecting your own, covering up your mistakes, making sure the wrong people never see justice. But times are changing. You just don't want to admit it." Holloway's jaw tightened, but his smile returned, colder this time. "That's a nice speech, Carter. Real inspiring." He stood slowly, adjusting his cuffs, his movements careful. "Let me tell you how this is gonna play out. The investigation is going to find something. Doesn't matter if it's real. Doesn't matter if it holds up. But the story will be there. The narrative that you let personal bias influence your decision, that you were reckless, that you targeted Collins out of some vendetta." Malik didn't move. Didn't react. "And when that happens, you're going to have two choices. You can fight it. Drag it out. Watch them pick apart your career, your record, your life. Watch them drag your father into this. Watch them turn you into the villain. Or," Holloway's eyes glinted, "you can walk away. Quietly. No charges. No trial. Just an early retirement and a clean exit." Silence stretched between them. Malik inhaled slowly, exhaling just as deliberately. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'll see you in court." Holloway let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as he stepped toward the door. "You really don't know when to quit." Malik's gaze never wavered. And that's why you're afraid of me. Holloway stopped. Just for a second. Then, without another word, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Malik stood there for a long moment, his fingers curling into fists, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. They were coming for him. He knew that now more than ever. But they had made one mistake. They thought fear would make him fold. They were wrong. The hearing was set. A review board. A panel of officials who would determine whether Malik Carter was still fit to serve. The news spread like wildfire. A black police chief under investigation after arresting a white officer for brutality. The headlines twisted the story, bent it, molded it into something that fed the right narratives. The ones that made Malik look like the problem. Malik expected it. But it still burned. James sat across from him the night before the hearing, sipping his coffee, watching him carefully. "You ready for this?" Malik nodded once. "Yeah." James studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I know you, Malik. I know you think this fight is yours to carry alone. But it's not. And you need to be prepared for the fact that no matter what happens tomorrow, they're going to do everything they can to make sure you never wear that badge again." Malik's jaw tightened. "Then they'll have to fight me for it." James exhaled, setting his mug down. "I just don't want you to end up like me." Malik frowned. "Like you?" James's expression was unreadable. "Tired. Fighting for something for so long that by the time you win, you don't even have the strength to celebrate." Malik felt something twist in his chest. He swallowed it down. "I'm not tired yet." James nodded slowly. "Then let's hope you don't get there." The silence between them was heavy. Full. But it was a silence of understanding. Malik knew what was coming. And whatever happened, he wouldn't back down. The hearing room was filled with a tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were straining under its weight. Rows of officers, city officials, and media personnel packed the space, eyes locked on Malik as he stood before the review board, his posture unshaken, his presence undeniable. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for. The moment the system had been counting on to break him. Holloway sat among the officials, his expression carefully neutral, but Malik saw it, the anticipation. The belief that this was the end of the road for him. That the system had done what it always did. Punished the man who exposed the problem instead of the problem itself. But what none of them had expected was what happened next. The doors at the back of the room opened, and James Carter walked in. He wasn't alone. Behind him, dozens of people followed, community members, activists, off-duty officers, and even some former victims of Collins who had never been given justice. They filled the seats, the aisles, standing shoulder to shoulder, silent but powerful. The room shifted, the energy changed, and Malik saw, for the first time, that the weight was no longer just on his shoulders. The board members exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others realizing that this was no longer just a case. It was a statement. A reckoning. James took a seat in the front row, meeting his son's gaze, giving him a nod. Malik felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly. No matter what happened today, he was not alone. The questioning began, one official after another trying to poke holes in his decision, in his leadership. They framed it as an overreach, as a moment of emotion clouding judgment. Malik let them talk. Let them weave their words, their carefully crafted narratives. Then, when it was his turn, he destroyed them with the truth. He spoke of Collins's history, of the system that had protected him for years, of the abuse that had been ignored until it landed on the wrong person. He laid it all bare, not with rage, not with emotion they could dismiss, but with facts. Undeniable evidence. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Holloway clenched his jaw. The tension in the room twisted into something else, realization. And then, the final blow. The footage. The security camera footage from the convenience store played on the screen behind him. No edits. No distortions. Just the raw, unfiltered truth. The silence that followed was deafening. And in that silence, the verdict was clear. Malik Carter would remain chief of police. The decision sent shockwaves through the room, through the city. Holloway stood, his face a mask of forced composure, but Malik saw the defeat in his eyes. He had lost. The system had bent, for once, in the right direction. Collins, now a convicted felon, had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The very system he had abused had turned on him, and he would now live under the same rules he once twisted for his own gain. His name, once one of power in the department, was now synonymous with disgrace. Holloway resigned a week later. His departure was quiet, without fanfare, without a press conference. A man who had spent years commanding respect left the department with no legacy worth remembering. James Carter walked a little taller after that. His hands still trembled sometimes, the trauma of that night still lingering in his bones, but there was a new strength in his step. People in his neighborhood saw him not as a victim, but as a survivor. A man whose story had helped expose a truth too many had ignored. And Malik? He kept fighting. He knew one case wouldn't fix the system. But it had shaken it. Had forced it to acknowledge something it had spent decades pretending wasn't real. As he sat in his office a week after the verdict, staring out at the city, his phone buzzed. A message from his father. Just 2 words. Keep going. And he would. Because this was just the beginning. This story isn't just about justice. It's about what it takes to get there. About how the people who should never have to fight for their dignity are the ones forced to do it the most. Malik Carter stood against a system that wanted to break him, and he won. But we all know the truth, not every story ends this way. How many cases like this have been buried? How many names have been forgotten because there was no camera, no witness, no voice loud enough to stop it? The fight for justice isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. So tell me, what would you have done in Malik's place? What would you do if the system that was supposed to protect you turned against you? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you want more stories like this, stories that expose the truth, that make you think, that keep you on the edge of your seat, subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the fight for justice never stops. And neither do we.